And now we will be joined by the Executive Director of Core Indonesia, Mohammad Faisal. Pak Faisal, glad to have you in our program. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
For the first question, Indonesia's third quarter growth was significantly higher than most other countries, namely the US, China, and even Singapore this year. In your opinion, is Indonesia's economy growing at a good level, Pak Faisal?
Yeah, I think so. Until the third quarter of 2022 this year, I think Indonesia is doing good. Even for the third quarter alone, I think it's great. I think so far, Indonesian economy is relatively more resilient to external pressure, but although a slightly low base effect because of the third quarter in 2021. So bear in mind that this is a year-on-year growth, and meaning that what has been achieved in the third quarter of 2022 is relatively to third quarter of last year, 2021. And if we remember, we can recall in last year in the third quarter there was Delta variant spread, and then there is a restrictions of mobility. So there is a slightly low base effect, but overall, I think the domestic consumption is good, as you said, and also the external trade also is also good. And if we look at the major contributors for the 5.7% growth in the third quarter, the domestic consumption and investment recovery continues almost at the same level as the pre-pandemic growth, despite inflation, of course, in September. But the effect of inflation is still minimum in this third quarter. And then the net export, the trade surplus increases because of commodity prices, of course. But even those commodity prices started to decline a little bit in the third quarter, but the trade surplus is still high. And then there is one more, the low base effect, if we look at the same quarter last year. So overall, I think it's in the third quarter shows that it's really good, and it is even above my expectations. Yeah.
Yes. No, that's the major contributors to the third quarter growth. Now let's talk about market projection for the third quarter growth. It was 6%, Pak Faisal, and as we all know, the realized percentage came out at 5.72%, even though this is the fastest growth in 1 year. So is this still a point of concern?
I think the concern is more of what will come after the third quarter. So for the third quarter alone, generally there is no serious concern, especially although if we look at as I said, domestic consumption and also investments actually still below the pre-pandemic level. If we look for the concerns, I think the only concern for the third quarter is actually the government spending that is still contractive. And I think it will continue to be contractive until next year. And this lower fiscal spending, not just because of deliberately lower targets for this year, but because also, but also due to the realization of the which is lower than the expectation or the target. And in 2023, fiscal deficit is targeted below 3%. That means there will be probably a further tightening of fiscal policy, and that will limit the extent of economic growth next year. And don't forget also the commodity prices, which I think will start to decline slowly but sure. Then I think that also will have less contribution to economic growth next year, later after the third quarter.
The next important question is, do you think Indonesia's economy is still relatively safe from the impacts of global recession?
Yeah, I think so. It is still safe because, first of all, Indonesia's economy is actually, we have a large domestic consumption, we have a large domestic economy, and the level of integration to the global economy is still relatively lower compared to many other peer countries. So meaning that a shock in the global economy will have relatively lower effect to Indonesian economy compared to, for example, Malaysia, Vietnam, Thailand, not to mention small countries like Singapore or Hong Kong. So Indonesia is relatively safe, but not necessarily or completely safe, because we also have some certain of integration to the global economy, and it will also depend on the policy response, especially for next year.
Okay. Now let's talk about export, Pak Faisal. Since Indonesia is an export-led country, do you think the slowdown in China would have significant impacts on the growth of Indonesia's economy, considering the fact that China is Indonesia's biggest trade partner?
Yes, absolutely. China has always been a big deal for Indonesia and for many other countries. So the slowdown in China is different from the current slowdown in China is different from that in the US and also the European Union, which is not because of rising inflation, but rather due to the zero COVID policy and climate change effect, the heat wave, and also problems in the property sector. So this is especially what happened in the second half of this year in China. However, if we look at the estimates of the IMF and also the World Bank for next year, I think China is estimated to start to rebound next year. So unlike the US and EU, which is estimated to be, slowed down for next year. Meanwhile, Indonesia's trade dependency is also still relatively lower compared to, as I said, many other peer countries. So as long as domestic economy is growing relatively well for Indonesia, I think the effect of China's slowdown to Indonesia should be smaller compared to many other peer countries.
Okay. Now we see that the government's continued efforts to maintain energy prices from soaring to unattainable heights like what we've seen in majority of other countries. How sustainable do you think this is, Pak Faisal?
Well, I think this is particularly the case for developed countries like European Union, especially European Union, and to some extent also the United States. And I think they have larger fiscal capacity compared to many developing countries in general. And it means that there have been lots of stimulus provided, but it will also depend on how well they respond to factors that have limited the supply of energy, particularly the Russian and also Ukrainian war, especially for the EU. For developing countries like Sri Lanka, for example, I think it will be more difficult because of their limited capacity, including limited capacity in fiscal. But for Indonesia, I think energy crisis is more of an issue in other countries instead of an issue in Indonesia. It is true that Indonesia is a net importer of oil, for example, and we still have but at the same time, we also still have large reserve of gas and coal. And we also have enormous non-renewable energy potentials. So for us, for Indonesia, I think the concern is more on how to transform from non-renewable energy to renewable energy.
Since you've mentioned about the energy crisis in Sri Lanka, Pak Faisal, is the Indonesian state budget structuring sustainable to avoid a major energy crisis like we've seen in Europe or Sri Lanka?
Well, we have, as I said, for developing countries like Indonesia, we still have a limited fiscal capacity. And we are now, in terms of the fiscal policy, is going to normalize for next year. So many of the stimulus will be limited starting next year. So the problem is more of about, I think, to make sure that the supply of energy is, enough, sufficient, and also affordable. So that's more of an issue in Indonesia. But the fiscal policy I think, is more on focusing on the efforts to transform from, as I said, from the non-renewable energy to renewable energy, which is still very limited in terms of the stimulus compared to many other G20 countries, for example.
Okay, now looking forward, Pak Faisal, we see that some ministers and Indonesian government convinced us that economies will grow well in the next quarter. The question is, are you optimistic about Indonesia's growth in the fourth quarter 2023? What is your projection?
Still positive, but there will be a slowdown in the fourth quarter, probably slightly below 5%. And I think similarly for the next year, because of, I think the effect of inflation will take effect, I think, especially the second and third round in the fourth quarter. And as I said, also the commodity prices, which is one of the major contributors to the high growth in the third quarter, will start to decline, meaning that the contribution of net export will be lower in the fourth quarter. But I think it's still quietly relatively strong, above 4%, but not as high as that in the third quarter.
Okay, what needs to be stabilized in order to keep this optimist projection still on the track, Pak Faisal?
I think the government should be very careful to normalize the policy, the fiscal and also monetary policy, to make sure that the policy will do not contradict with the efforts to maintain or to sustain the purchasing power, especially for the domestic economy and the consumers, Indonesian consumers in general. And also, we'll look at how to prioritize the incentives for the producers and for some business players, especially because they are still, struggling with the effects of the pandemic, as we call as a scarring effect. And there is new challenge of inflation, also the global recession. So I think the government need to consider the further incentives, especially for sectors that is still vulnerable to external shocks.
And then the next question is, what will be the biggest challenge for Indonesian economy, especially we're counting weeks to 2023, Pak Faisal?
Yeah, the biggest challenge is, of course, the first one is actually inflation, and also the other one is to make sure that domestic economy have still grow relatively strong amongst the global shocks right now. So to make sure that the global pressure, the transmission of global pressures to domestic economies relatively low or limited by policy responses, either through fiscal or monetary policy.
All right. Pak Faisal, thank you so much for joining us on Jakarta Movers and Shakers.
You're welcome.
Stay safe and see you in our next opportunities.